The Layton prequel trilogy is an interesting collection of games. It's safe to say the prequels are far more controversial than the original trilogy, with many openly critical of its more fantastical stories and backstory additions to already well-beloved characters. Their statuses as prequels certainly didn't help, giving the games an air of purposelessness. We know how this all ends, and no one ever mentioned these adventures previously, so how important could they really be? Still, it seems like the prequel trilogy is often unfairly maligned. For as unnecessary as they could seem, the prequels frequently expand the notion of what it means to be a Layton game, playing with the established formula in more and less subtle ways. This is especially true of the 3DS entries, so it's a bit ironic that for all the criticisms of the prequels being redundant, the games are often critiqued for precisely the ways in which they deviate from the traditional Layton formula. Miracle Mask subverts the typical mystery format by revealing near explicitly who the identity of the masked gentleman is towards the beginning of the game. The criticism is usually that Miracle Mask's central mystery is painfully obvious, but this ignores the ways in which Miracle Mask ceases to function as a coherent narrative if we aren't aware of the gentleman's identity from the get-go. Maybe I should save this discussion for my Miracle Mask video. Azran Legacy radically shifts the formula of the series away from total linearity to something more bite-sized and open. It leans into a more adventurous and fantastical tone, with airship chases and magical artifacts. It offers a more soapy, melodramatic narrative than what is typical for the series. All three of these differentiating aspects comprise a majority of the criticism towards Azran Legacy. This is not to suggest all of these criticisms have no merit. On the contrary, I agree with some of them, but it seems to me these games are often punished for trying to do something different, rather than focusing on the merits of their approach itself. And that's a shame, because as the first entry in the prequel trilogy would show, something different was exactly what was needed. Last Specter was doomed to underwhelm. Coming right off the heels of the series' most critically acclaimed entry, an epic trilogy capper, the appetite for more Layton wasn't exactly at an all-time high. Last Specter would arrive nevertheless, just one short year later. If ever there was a game to seem redundant, this was it. Unwound Future had fundamentally altered the course of the series. It's difficult to overstate how much the game set in stone many of the foundations the series would continue to adhere to thereafter. The story and setting would focus on a thriving metropolis of activity, rather than the obscured and quiet villages and towns of Curious Village and Diabolical Box. It gave a full view of staple locations like London, Gressenheller, the police station, the characteristic look of Layton's office. It placed a broader emphasis on interpersonal drama amongst the main cast, in a way that previous entries largely avoided, with Layton and Luke often being ciphers for the story around them. The games would be vastly more cinematic, with more voice acting and cutscenes than ever before. Unwound Future had set the new standard for Layton. In this way, Last Specter feels more familiar than ever. Not only does the gameplay look virtually identical to the entries before it, the game also frames its story in a way that emulates Unwound Future. Last Specter pitches itself as telling the origins of Luke, explaining how he and the Professor became an inseparable duo. It's hard to imagine Curious Village or Diabolical Box caring about such a thing. Yet Last Specter's familiarity doesn't end there. The game consciously evokes Curious Village in a variety of ways. One of the intro cinematics sees Layton driving out on the rural countryside, discussing the central mystery of the game to his assistant via recently received correspondence. Instead of a golden apple, Layton and Emmy discuss finding the golden garden hidden somewhere in the town of Mistallery. Even Mistallery recalls the relatively isolated Saint Mystere, a town so secretive London doesn't even know the regular happenings, despite its closest to the city. A looming mansion serves to catch our eye as our first impression of Mistallery, much as the tower did in Saint Mystere. The game even features a segment where we have to chase a cat down, much like Curious Village's second chapter. All of this is to say that Last Specter feels like something of a reimagining of Curious Village, just told in a distinctly Unwound Future style. To be fair, Last Specter is somewhat self-conscious about its identity. It doesn't exactly try to hide its influences. When Emmy learns about the Specter and the secret message within the letter, she describes the situation as being Layton-esque. It's a sentiment echoed by Descalay at the end of the game, just after Layton unmasks his identity.
Congratulations, that was truly Layton-esque.
It's a strange thing to say. Despite the fact that Last Specter is canonically Layton's first adventure, the characters around him already seem to recognize Layton and his adventures as having a very unique style. For as much as Last Specter is supposed to be about Layton forging that distinctive identity, the game doesn't wait long to suggest it's already been found. Given all of what I've said here, it's not hard to see why Last Specter usually finds itself firmly in the underwhelming rankings of the series. Rather than carve out new spaces for the series to explore, as the games before and after did, Last Specter offers a particularly unchallenging view of the Layton series. You're getting pretty much exactly what you expect here. And while this is certainly true, I would argue that Last Specter utilizes the standard formula more interestingly than all the games before it, probing more deeply into its characters and setting to create perhaps the most thematically rich game in the franchise. While Mistallery may superficially resemble locales from the first two games, it does a fantastic job creating a wholly unique place for the series to explore. Last Specter is a game fascinated with fairy tales, and it sets this interest in motion even more quickly than it starts making curious village references. The opening scene of the game is Descalé reading a fairy tale aloud, telling a story about a shadowy specter saving a small village from bandits.
Long ago, in a lawless age, a pack of bandits invaded a small village. Amidst the chaos, a terrified young farm girl played her flute to drown out the madness.
Mistallery reflects this interest quite clearly. Oftentimes the characters just literally say it, framing their time in the town as if they were part of an ongoing story.
Peace is restored, and everyone lived happily ever after!
The final act belongs to me.
Even Layton himself suggests that Mistallery was ripped straight out of a fairy tale. It's hard not to see why he says this. The town lays upon winding hills, narrow canals running through just about every avenue and cul-de-sac. Lush greenery surrounds the outskirts, the game even devoting a small zone for a picturesque patch of forest, with sunbeams emanating through the canopy. The dark palace at the top of the town, Bard Manor, is perhaps the most obvious example, a structure adorned with regal purples and spiraling towers. Fairy tales often originated within the rural countryside, people and neighbors relaying tales and stories to one another. Mistallery perfectly captures such an atmosphere. Beyond just the environment, Mistallery's residents also capture the more fantastical elements of a fairy tale. Layton and Emmy discover a damaged house with a strange mark on it almost immediately after entering town. They find out the cause is the witch who ostensibly resides within Bard Manor, spreading curses throughout the town of those who speak ill about her. In the marketplace, the group is accosted by a towering figure known as the Black Raven, who appears to possess the ability to teleport. The eponymous Specter speaks for itself, especially when one half of it starts actually speaking for itself, in the form of a giant sea monster. No matter where you go or look, Mistallery seems to provide another fantastical creature just beyond the corner. Last Specter also reflects its interest in fairy tales beyond just its setting though. Fairy tales, at least in their older conceptions, were often darker and moodier, not shying away from fairly brutal depictions of violence and abuse, contrary to many of the more sanitized Disney versions of the tales. Last Specter seems to acknowledge this reality, if only a little. A major plot thread in the game involves the apparent suicide of Evan Bard, a man the village despised for extorting the residents through their properties. We follow along with Ariana and Tony, Bard's kids, who were seemingly abandoned and left no inheritance to their name, left to rot in an unkempt manner. Another storyline sees Clark blackmailed in a hostage situation, forcing him to adhere to Descalé's will lest he harm Clark's wife and butler. These scenes in particular are great, giving a palpable sense of tension that really only exists in hindsight. It's hard not to feel bad for Clark, while he desperately attempts to goad Layton into choosing some wine from his cellar, despite Dolan's protestations. Of course, it's important not to overstate the case here. Last Specter is in no way a graphic or quote-unquote adult video game. Indeed, Last Specter can often feel quite childlike in its approach. After the group bests Descalé, he signals his renewed vengeance against Layton, as if he were just defeated in some Saturday morning cartoon.
Savor this victory, Layton. Only certain defeat lies in your future. Witnessing your downfall will be delicious.
Still, it's difficult to imagine any Disney movie taking much interest in the legitimacy of inheritance documents in a potential suicide. From its gray, misty skies to its often drab, run-down landmarks, there's a pervasive sense of eerie within Last Specter that situates itself neatly within the context of a fairy tale come to life. It would be a mistake to suggest that Last Specter was only interested in the aesthetics of a fairy tale. Instead, the game is more interested in the utility behind those tales. I mentioned before that Last Specter occasionally feels like a children's story. This is appropriate because Last Specter is deeply invested in the lives of the kids living in Mistallery. More specifically, Last Specter continually depicts kids having to venture out into the world far before their time, a childhood stripped away from them. A large focus of the game is on Luke, who takes control of the investigation into the Spectre after his father turns cold and distant. Ariana and Tony must fend for themselves after their father dies. The Black Raven turns out to be a group of kids playing a collective character, using the black market to make money after their parents lose their jobs. Layton speculates that Lucia first ventured to the outside world after the death of her parents. Interestingly, Last Specter is quite pointed about why these events are taking place. Rather than an unfortunate coincidence or natural disaster, the game suggests it is the adults who are the architects of their own kids' destruction. Luke is openly hostile to all adults, suspecting his father is being controlled by the Spectre. He hides information away from Layton and Emmy because he feels he cannot trust them. Some of the Black Ravens comment that the reason they need to provide for themselves is because some of their parents simply abandoned them. The town's abandonment of Ariana and Tony is largely due to the actions of Evan Bard, as the people place the sins of the father upon the two siblings. There's a sense in which even the institutions within Mistallery are openly hostile towards the children. The police force is blatantly corrupt and is willing to arrest both Lucia and Ariana with virtually no evidence, while the police chief forges evidence, sends guards to assault Layton and Emmy, and openly berates Luke for being the mayor's son. Furthermore, Luke's intuition about his father is ultimately correct, as Clark is in the pocket of the police force via Descalay, meaning even the mayor of Mistallery is in league with the Spectre. Industrialization within Mistallery quite literally poisons the children, with one character commenting on how Evan Bard demanding the newly established factory be shut down after it polluted the air and caused Ariana's life-threatening illness to worsen. These facts get at the true terror of the Spectre. Rather than the monsters under the bed, Last Specter worries that the monsters are the ones tucking you in at night instead. What if the people and places charged with your protection are actually trying to harm you? What if they simply don't care? One of the most interesting scenes in the game has Luke attempt to explain what he feels is the true nature of the Spectre. The Spectre threatens to do more than just destroy our town. The Spectre can destroy the very fabric of our families. It ruins not just our houses, but our homes. When we become filled with fear, our hearts go cold, and I fear that has already happened. In this way, the Spectre is neither a giant sea creature nor a digging machine, but the apathetic hearts and minds of Mistallery, a growing cynicism about the world, where people learn not to care about anything else other than their own desires, even if they have to ruin their own children to achieve them. Luke suggests that the Spectre will cause the world to end. Considering the nature of the Spectre he presents, it's hard not to agree. Yet there seems to be a discrepancy between the Spectre Luke presents and the legendary Spectre Descalay reads at the beginning of the game. The Spectre in the fairy tale states emphatically that it protected the town from plunderers, called upon by a village farm girl. This version of the Spectre seems to closely align with Lucia, a creature who responds to the calls of Ariana, and who defends the town from Descalay's attempts to unearth the Golden Garden. As it turns out, the precious air from the garden is the key to curing Ariana's illness. As such, Lucia was in fact trying to save Ariana's life, as the legend suggests. So how can this Spectre be reconciled with Luke's claim that the Spectre is a destructive force? The answer lies again with Last Specter's fascination with fairy tales. As Luke points out, the Spectre has been a part of Mistallery for generations, wherein the keepers of the town become nothing more than pawns. Just as the Spectre protects the town, Luke argues that the Spectre also wishes to defend itself, to keep itself alive in the pages of Mistallery's mythology. It is vital for the fairy tale to continue. It makes sense then that Last Specter would feel somewhat ambivalent about the process of urbanization. I've already mentioned the Ghost Factory, which simultaneously brought jobs to the townspeople while at the same time poisoning them. But the Golden Garden represents another strong example. While Layton and Rosa are discussing the prospects of discovering the garden, Rosa laments the effects it would have on Mistallery. Then they would just mess it up with a fish and chips shop next to the ticket booth, mark my words. Rosa fears that such a discovery will pervert Miss Tallery into a gaudy tourist trap, overrun with predatory shops and tacky merchandise. We see the beginnings of such a future in the game itself. Two minor characters, Maggie and Otaki-san, explicitly travel to Miss Tallery as tourists to see the evidence of the Golden Garden. Maggie complains about how dull the town is. Even Layton seems to agree with Rosa's fears. At the end of the game, once the Golden Garden is discovered, he decides to keep it a secret until Ariana has improved. The implication is that once the public gains awareness of it, the garden will lose its healing properties, reconfigured from a breathing prehistoric ecosystem into a mere cultural artifact for study. There's something logical in Last Specter's ambivalence. As I mentioned before, fairy tales were a staple of word-of-mouth rural communities. Bringing the public eye to Miss Tallery threatens to upend the fog which surrounds it, and put a stop to the fairy tale which has sustained it for so long. In the end, despite this ambivalence, Last Specter ultimately argues that the show must go on. There became a point in time at which the legend of the Specter began to harm Miss Tallery rather than help it. The game makes clear that the police's corruption was only allowed to continue unabated for so long precisely because the town kept a low profile. The police in London are shown never to even have heard of news regarding the giant Specter, despite the situation having gone on for months. Tony must give up the tale of his sister being a witch after he's confronted with evidence that it is only pushing the residents further away from Ariana. Luke and Clark both feel suffocated by the smallness of Miss Tallery and wish to move on to bigger things in their lives. Both leave the town shortly after the ending of the game, the former wanting to travel the world with Layton, a wish finally granted in Azran Legacy. The Golden Garden is ultimately revealed to the public after Ariana gets better, even if it might turn Miss Tallery into a tourist trap. Because fairy tales were spread by word of mouth, it is largely impossible to point to any definitive version of any particular tale. It is most likely that all of the tales have countless, forever undocumented retellings. This is a feature of fairy tales, not a flaw. It is in a fairy tale's nature to change. The Specter started out as a force for good, a defender of the town against an unjust attack. But when that story was put to paper, integrated into the very fabric and identity of the town, made more permanent than it was ever meant to be, the power of the Specter began to change. It warped into Luke's version, an unassailable creature who keeps Miss Tallery in an unalterable fog, an inviolable canon which must be allowed to perpetuate itself, no matter who it damages along the way. But as with Lucia, the story must eventually come to an end. Lucia gave Ariana her life back and then, having served her purpose, was content to move on. Ariana no longer needed the Specter anymore. The fairy tale must be allowed to change. When examining the game overall, it's fairly impressive how little actually occurs in Last Specter. The Specter itself only really appears in 2 small scenes, and other than that, you spend most of the time strolling through the town, chatting up the locals and tapping away at pipes. For as critical as characters like Ariana and Lucia are, it's surprising to think that they aren't introduced until the halfway mark, or in Lucia's case, not until chapter 8 of 10. It would be reasonable to suggest that the game would have benefited from introducing some of these characters and storylines a bit earlier. By waiting until the second half, Last Specter sometimes buckles under the weight of trying to tie all these sudden loose ends together. Layton seems certain that the death of Evan Bard is connected to the Specter, but in hindsight, it's really not clear how. We know that Jakes forged the will to make Bard's inheritance go to Clark, but how this at all relates to the Specter is left uncommented. We can at least presume that Descalais wanted to use this inheritance, perhaps to commission the construction of the digging devices, weaponizing his control over Clark to make the search for the Golden Garden easier. But the game itself never really makes this connection, and considering most of the 7th chapter, one of the longest chapters in the game, is centrally about this mystery, this seems like an odd omission. Jakes is another loose end Last Specter fumbles. While thematically appropriate, Jakes is a painfully shallow character that the game barely devotes any screen time to, an atypically evil character in a series that generally finds humanity in even its worst villains. This leads to perhaps the worst scene in the entire series, where Jakes, for absolutely no reason whatsoever, bursts out in the most over-the-top evil laugh imaginable. If the idea was to establish him as the villain, I'm pretty sure the scene right before where he threatens to throw Layton out of the town was more than sufficient. As we've seen, Last Specter often expresses itself as a kid's bedtime story, but this moment oversteps itself into patronizing excess. In the end, Jakes is simply the fat bad man, whose final scene in the game is getting stuck in a drainage pipe. Not great stuff. Still, none of these flaws are anywhere near terminal. Even if all of the various storylines don't connect as well as they ought to, they're perfectly in line with the game's interests and fascinations, which gives them a cohesion they otherwise wouldn't have. Additionally, Last Specter's somewhat lackadaisical pacing ends up being one of the game's biggest strengths. Far from the bustling streets of London, the colorful artistry of Monte d'Or, and the adventurous locales in Azran Legacy, Last Specter's Mistallery feels like the last time in the series where we just get to breathe and soak in the atmosphere. It's refreshing. Last Specter cannot be called a reinvention in any meaningful way. It is the Layton formula down to the template. However, it would be a mistake to say that Last Specter does nothing worthwhile with that template. Rather, Last Specter pushes the template to its fullest, carefully crafting its setting and characters to provide perhaps the most interesting and thoughtful story in the series. It's a story about the malleability of fairy tales, about childhood's end. While I can't say that Last Specter is my personal favorite entry, it did manage to find a fairly compelling spin on an extremely familiar formula. For being the fourth game in what was an annually released series, that's no small feat.